one who ain't never had a love, yeah. This one's for the girl who don't feel like she's enough, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. This one's for the cool kid playing on the school team, crying to himself cause he never had the prom queen. Head full of wands, but they said it's just a pipe dream, yeah. This one's for the kids like me, they ain't never had one day. The ladies always turn their cheek, but they ain't let the fat ones sing. This one's for the kids like me, kept working when they had nothing. When people try to take their dreams, they stuck it to them, please don't change.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Alex Cuesta Show. How's everybody doing out there on this Wednesday, January 29th, 2025? We are almost into February already of the new year. It is crazy. I appreciate everyone out there that is watching, that is listening to this on podcast form. As we can all see, no David tonight. He hasn't been here now for 3 weeks on our interview shows, so I don't know if we're going to fire him soon. But he's the only one that wants to hang around with me every once in a while, so I got to keep him around a little bit. But overall, I appreciate everybody that's here, whether you are watching on YouTube, Rumble, Kick, X, Facebook. Please go, like, share, follow, subscribe, repost, all of that good stuff. Go tell your friends that we're here. Spread all this word of mouth. It's the biggest way that you can get, especially these Wednesday interviews, out there for everyone to see, because we always appreciate when we get more people coming in to watch and things like that, because we have awesome guests and they need to be put out there. Before we get into any of the fun stuff, obviously, as always, we are now, 9 days into the Trump administration. I still have yet to see the Epstein client list. I am hopeful that we get it, but I gave him almost 10 days and I've kind of been nice about it. I'm going to start not being nice soon and kind of ripping Trump and Kash Patel very soon. If we don't get that Epstein client list out there, it's one of the things that Kash Patel said he would do. It's one of the things Donald Trump mulled over he would do. And as a supporter of both of theirs, it's my job to get on them when they're not doing it. So absolutely, the Epstein client list, let's not forget about that. And making sure that if you have another podcaster or show that you watch, make sure you leave a comment in there and hopefully you get them to talk about it, because it needs to be brought up so that the powers that be eventually will get around to putting pressure on Trump, Kash Patel, and the likes. I want to remember to continue to send anything that you can over to the Helene and Milton victims over in North Carolina. And also don't forget about Tennessee. They were hit pretty hard. Definitely help them out because they have nothing. It's freezing. They're going through winter storms. Money's fine. But if you could find your favorite organization and send supplies, whether it is jackets, gloves, anything you can send it to them, because they are in dire need. Even with President Trump trying to put the full Monty down to help them, it's going to take a little bit of time for the government to get going. And also those in California that lost, because not everyone there that lost in California are millionaires. They didn't have the $5 to $50 million homes. There's parts of LA that are suburbs, and those people are in need as well. They lost everything. So if you can send out there as well, always go try to find out churches. I'm sure Mercury One is on the ground there as well. Mercury One is the group that I choose to support. So figure out who you support and definitely go out there and help out if you can. And lastly, we can't let up, because just because Donald Trump is elected in an office, there's an election this year, there's midterms next year, there's always elections. We cannot let up on what we are doing. And on that note, I want to bring in our guest, because this is somebody that is going to help you understand why we cannot let up. He's incredibly important. He's somebody that I think we need to get out there more and more. His voice is fantastic in the fight against wokeism and all the things going on. I'm going to bring him in. He is Steven Welliever. Did I say your name last night? Welliever?
Yep.
There you go. What's going on, Steven? How are you?
Hey, good to be here.
So you're somebody who I think that we need to make sure we work to get you out there more, because you have your X page And the reason why I found out about you and who you are is because I listen, it's no secret, I listen to New Discourses and James Lindsay. And at the beginning of his most recent podcast about the root of DEI being in Stalin's Soviet Union, he gave you a shout out and said to go follow your X page and that it has a wealth of knowledge. And when I looked out on there, I was like, yeah, James isn't wrong. And especially when it comes to those things that he researches, he's typically not wrong about who he recommends. So, me being who I am, shot you a quick little XDM and I was like, hey, do you want to come on? You were gracious enough to agree real quick. We got this set up and I'm excited to hear about your wisdom, man.
All right. I'm ready to share.
Let's do it. So first things first, you're someone who I describe here as an anti-communism, anti-DEI activist. Am I right in kind of that being like a base description of you, or how would you describe yourself?
I would agree with that. Yeah. Yeah.
So I want to get into you because you were a teacher over in Washington, if I'm not correct, right? Washington
That's
State,
correct. Yep.
and also an independent scholastic administrator as well.
Yeah. I was the head of a smaller independent private school.
Okay, that's really awesome. So you were a teacher, but you left and now you're living in West Virginia. You're a construction worker. What made you get the shift out of teaching? And I can imagine in Washington, it was wackadoo. I'm here in New York State. We're basically like junior West Coast. But what made you leave teaching?
This was kind of early on when the woke stuff was really starting to hit hard. And I was living in the Washington State Capitol, Olympia, Washington, across town from the Evergreen State College, where
Oof,
the big meltdown, happened in 2017.
yeah.
I was the head of a small independent private school. I actually had a lot of Evergreen State College administrators, not only as parents of students, but my board also had college administrators serving on it at the
Wait a
time.
minute. So at Evergreen College, where they want every single person to live in communes and throw a bunch of money at public schools, they were putting their kids in a private school setting. There's no
Yeah.
hypocrisy there.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep, that's true.
So yeah, keep on going. So what else happened there?
Okay, so uh like I said, this was right before it really kind of hit full force, but it was kind of in the toxic masculinity fight phase of it. And for whatever reason, there was kind of an uprising amongst some of the faculty that were trying to drive a teacher out
Yep.
for allegedly being somewhat toxically masculine. And he he was a great teacher, wasn't violating any school policies, well
Now I always get
respected.
this one wrong. Is this Ben Weinstein? Is that the one that was? I forget, it was one of those. I know it was. This is
That
maybe it's
was
going to make me like.
he was at the college. I'm talking about on my own
Oh,
faculty at
okay, okay,
the school I was working at, that I was the
gotcha.
administrator of. They were trying to run a teacher out, and I was, for whatever reason, I was I was kind of targeted along with that in not firing him.
Okay.
So then it kind of turned on me, and we were kind of being put through struggle sessions week after week after week. This was when my children were young too. I was spending evenings with the board grilling me on petty grievances about every little thing.
So at
Like,
this time, did you know that they were struggle sessions? Were you
I
aware of
didn't
what
know,
you were
this
being
is, like
put
I
through?
said, this is before the woke thing kind of hit full
Gotcha.
force. But
Yeah.
being Olympia, Washington, and being across town from the Evergreen State College, I wasn't really aware of everything that was going on. And so now, in retrospect, I kind of put it all together. But
Yeah.
basically, from this was going on for months, and ultimately, they took away my authority, and that's what I ended up resigning over the fact that I had so much of my time being wasted, especially when my children were young, that I couldn't deal with it anymore, and just the stress of being put through these sessions when I wasn't budging on. I had my firm position. I wasn't going to go
Good
anywhere,
for you.
but they still kept after I wouldn't go anywhere for after a couple, 6 weeks worth. Oh, you're going to get another weeks worth. And it just kept going and going and going. I wasn't going to budge. And eventually I ended up resigning. At that point, that was pretty much the end of my career, because that's when the woke stuff hit full force. And there were two reasons why it pretty much ended my career. Number one was they started changing the certification rules for being a teacher or administrator. And that was, you had to, basically, there were standards for DEI that you had to fall in line with. Yep. And they were pretty extreme. You had to follow in line with these DEI rules. And not only that, you had to show that you were actively pursuing the goals of them.
Yeah, you needed to be anti-racist. It wasn't enough to just be like, I don't hate anybody. You had to actively be showing your anti-racist or anti-racist. Not, I don't know what their stupid Ibram X Kendi bullshit is.
Yeah. So that was one of the reasons I couldn't go along with that, because I already knew what this stuff was all about once it hit.
Yeah.
Secondly, there was another reason, was when I was interviewing, I was pretty much told I was now obsolete as a teacher, because I had been teaching more advanced science courses.
How many years were you a teacher before this all happened?
Oh, this is roughly 15.
Oof. So you were tenured and everything was like you.
I was in the sort of the prime of my career. Yeah.
Wow.
And that's when it ended. And
Jesus.
So I was pretty much told I was obsolete, because I was teaching these advanced science courses that we didn't have kids anymore with the proper education to take a traditional biology course, to take a traditional chemistry course.
Were you finding that they wanted to steer they wanted to steer more towards the social sciences as being the correct science instead of more of your traditional sciences?
As it is now, it's all being directed into career technical education, really dumbed down CTE, as well as climate communism as the science courses.
So you have all that. So really quick, I want to go, our boy Nate G, he's always here with us whenever we do our shows. He comments and said, you had me at anti-commie. So he likes you for that. And he also wants to know, are you familiar with John Taylor Gatto?
That name doesn't sound familiar to
Nate,
me.
You bring up John Taylor Gatto, anyone that shoots DEI, and I feel like you're enlightening the world. So I'm pretty sure John Taylor Gatto has wrote a few books on things like this that's going on in education. So might be someone that you would possibly agree with. I don't know. I've never read, and Nate's gonna be mad at me because he brings up John Taylor Gatto all the time, and I never read him. I'm sorry, Nate. You could be angry at me, but so you go through that, and your career basically ends. So now you have a whole entire shift. So did you basically look at the landscape of education and go, even if I could get back in, I don't want to? Or was it something where you didn't think you'd be able to get back in, period?
It was two reasons. I wasn't going to go along with DEI communism stuff at all. And I'll fill in more details about that.
Yeah, definitely.
And second was, they basically told me your services are no longer needed, because we don't need anyone who teaches the courses that you teach anymore.
That's crazy. That is wild. Okay, so you decide to make the shift. What makes you go to become a construction worker in West Virginia? When did that all come about?
I recently moved to West Virginia just about 2 years ago, but I was working in construction in Washington State before that. And you gotta pay the bills, you gotta make a living. I can work hard. I'm used to using I'd done labor before, so I just, that's what I did to pay the bills. And there's not as much hassle in being given to you about DEI stuff, unless you're working for a bigger company, or you're getting government contract work. If you're just doing roofing on regular people's houses, they don't really care who you are, what your thoughts are.
No, for the most part, they just want you to get it done, do a good job, and make sure the roof doesn't fall in.
And I'm the guy there with the job site radio listening to state school board meetings while I'm shooting shingles on a roof.
Oh my God. So Nachi comes back saying that John Taylor Gatto, he's not DEI in education. He was a New York City Teacher of the Year multi times, and he wrote 3 books about the failures of the Department of Education. So someone you'd probably be interested in because he probably has insight what went on.
Got
There
his
you go.
name written down. Yep.
There you go. So you'll definitely go look it up. And Nate, if you will, Nate, you should go follow Steven over there at his Twitter handle, Steven Welliever. And so you're in construction now, but you still have a hobby of going to your local school board meetings and basically talking about all of the DEI and, as you phrase it, Bolshevik type of things being included in those. Before we get into the nitty gritty and the details, what have those been like as you've confronted these school boards in talking about this? Have you gotten contentious things? Have you gotten police? Like, what has that been like?
My local school board, I'm still kind of observing them and seeing what's going on. I haven't really gone full force and confronted them on a few. I have given public comment already, but I'm
Okay.
I'm kind of strategizing what to do. In West Virginia, we recently had our new governor Morrissey give an executive order on DEI in education, saying no more. We're not going to do this anymore. And I'm I'm now there to make sure at the ground level he follows through on that.
So, quick thing there. Are you also of the same mindset as me where just because they're not calling it DEI anymore doesn't mean anything? Because as we know, as you're going to get into, the names change, but the things stay the same. Like their goals, what they want to do stays the same. So, are you still staying very vigilant as to, yes, we're not calling it diversity, equity, inclusion anymore, but are the people that are supposed to be fired not there anymore? Are they still there? Are you staying vigilant on that side?
I know exactly what DEI is conceptually. So if they try to name shift, I know what it is, and not only do I know what it is, I know how the dialectic progresses and what comes after it. So I know how it evolves, and I know how to look for those changes. What people may be considering as a victory right now
Nope.
and putting something down, they don't understand that that's how it's designed, and it's designed to progress to something next that could be worse.
So what it's progressing towards, have you heard of Bridge? Oof,
Bridge.
you got to look that up. Look up DEI to Bridge. There is a VTuber. So I like gaming. I don't know how you feel about gaming and things like that. I don't game, but I like to still pay attention to the gaming world. My brother's more of a gamer, but there is this YouTuber. She's a VTuber named Kirsha, who is on top of the, DEI is gone, but they moved to this thing called Bridge, which is kind of the next level of DEI, and she's done some deep dives on it herself if you ever wanted to go look up on her YouTube. And that's the next stage, and it's something that they think that they're masking, but it's being exposed, which I think is awesome. So
Yeah,
yeah, I'm giving you a lot of things to go research now.
I'm writing them down as we go, so that's good. But what I've been noticing is they've been following a script, and that was kind of my thesis from the beginning, going back, I don't know how many years now, at least 8 years.
Yeah.
I think that's when I first came up with my sort of thesis of what's going on. And they've been following a script pretty carefully of what the Bolsheviks did. And so as this shifts from DEI now, I kind of know what to look for. Especially, I don't know if you've noticed some of the messaging coming out of the Democratic Party and some of their candidates. It's very class oriented, and they're pointing their fingers at the wealthy now.
Oh, they've gone full on leftist. And the thing is too, it's like I've said to everyone, because what do you classically hear is like, oh, well, these aren't yesterday's Democrats. Yesterday's Democrats really loved America. And I'm a historian. I was a history major at Marist, and I'm looking at FDR. I'm looking at Woodrow Wilson. I'm looking at Martin Van Buren over in New York City. I'm like, the fuck they were. Like, these people were always who they were. And my whole theory and thesis has been that the Democrats were smart enough to push slightly give a little, push slightly, and then you had the squad come in and they kind of kicked the doors in, and that's where we've been since the squad came in and wanted to go full communist, which everyone's saying they're shaking Cenk Uygur's hand. Cenk Uygur founded the Justice Democrats, which gave us the squad. So fuck that guy. But it's so I've noticed that too. And my whole belief is they've always been leftist. There's a reason why Hitler looked at Jim Crow so fondly and why he took so much from what the leftist from the South did to the Native Americans, the Indians, and also looking at FDR as one of the greatest fascists of all time over in North America, stating it publicly. And then also looking at our eugenics projects with Planned Parenthood and going, yeah, we're not going to go that far, which is crazy if you look at some of the things that they used to say in kind of their their Politburos for the Nazis.
Yeah. Don't get me started on FDR and there's well, maybe we'll talk about that as we get into the details, because he did some things that most people aren't aware of with
Yeah, we could definitely get into that. So I want to give my other comment with Nate G here. John Taylor Gatto's book, Weapons of Mass Instruction, which sharpen the swords in which our current activists are armed with. So I guess it's definitely on the line of, reading that would let us know it's kind of like what you reading Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals and also Beautiful Troubles, like the current itineration. So basically a warning as to what is coming is essentially what Nate is saying. So something I have to read. Nate, keep reminding me about John Taylor Gatto so I can read him and stop being a lazy ass every once in a while. But I want to jump in at the history side now because we got in your backstory. You're a construction worker now, but you still are active in trying to obviously protect your kids from engaging and getting this stuff taught to them, but also trying to being another voice to ring the bell about what is going on. So I want you to kind of in layman terms, as well as you can, give us the origins of DEI, because according to you, and I don't think many people know this, it's not something that just flowered out from Kimberly Crenshaw and not, it wasn't just as recent as the 60s. This goes further. So where is the actual roots of DEI?
Okay. Yeah. I gotta admit, first to start off, I'm not familiar with any of this new stuff. The Kimberly Crenshaws, the Ibram Kendis, I haven't read a word they've said. Sometimes, I hear what they say, and
You're not missing out.
What I usually do is take Stalin's words and paste them right next to theirs so they can see they're exactly the same. I don't really pay attention to what
Steven, it's just a coincidence that the people that they read and studied, they're actually saying the same words. Don't you know that? It's always a coincidence.
Yeah. So, and honestly, that was the plan. So we'll go back to the beginning. I personally have family. I'm not much of an identitarian at all, but other than being an American, but I do have family roots in Ukraine and Russia. My family was part of the German minority that lived in Ukraine and Russia going back about 200 years, since the time of Catherine the Great. And when I was young, there was kind of this, my grandmother spoke very accented English. And it was like, oh, we were Germans, but we were from the Black Sea. We weren't from Germany. But after that, the conversation was completely canceled, shut down. You don't need to know anything else. And that was kind of weird to me. And so there was kind of a silence.
So they were essentially the Germanic people that von Bismarck couldn't get to unify, right? Because obviously Otto von Bismarck unified all of Germany, but he couldn't get all of the Germanic region to come. There were some regions that were like, piss off. Were they basically that region, or were they already claimed by more of the Slavics as their group? Because
they had already left Germany long before then, before unification, and they lived relatively isolated on the steppe.
Got it.
But anyhow, we'll get into the details there. But there was this silence about this history, complete silence, and part of that was because what happened was so traumatic. They didn't want to pass on what happened during the Lenin-Stalin years to the next generation. And so it stayed completely silent until about the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then, that's the time Gen X, I was born in 74. So that's the time when we're reaching adulthood, and usually people aren't hanging around their elderly grandparents baking, rolling, pounding dough and rolling, baking bread with them. But for whatever reason, I felt necessary to hang out with the elderly people as I was reaching
You're a good
adulthood.
grandson.
And yeah, and that's when people were started talking. It was a very lucrative time for that information to finally, people felt free to finally talk about what had gone on. And so I didn't get all the details, but I got enough passed down that I kind of had a general sense of what had happened in that time period.
So, as a young man, when you were hearing all these details from your family, did you kind of look back at your American education through history and be like, why didn't we learn about any of this? Because when I look back at it, it was all like fascism took up basically all of the modern world like history. And all we were taught about with communism was communism's bad, Cuban Missile Crisis, the Russian Revolution, generally it. They didn't mention anything truly about what went on. The most we got of Stalin was he wasn't a great guy, but he really helped us out in the Second World War. And that's like really all you got. You got this inference, like the gulags, they happened, but we didn't know. We didn't read like any of Solzhenitsyn's excerpts, which should be mandatory in school that you read some stuff from him. And we never learned anything about Mao's China, which was a direct, correlation to what went on with Russia or anything with Pol Pot or any of that crap. So, did you look back as you were hearing these stories from your relatives, your grandparents, and go, why didn't we learn any of this in school?
Yeah, there was no place to look that information up either. It was sort of what you were hearing, and then there was a dead end.
Yeah.
And so I think around 2000, there was a Harvard researcher named Terry Martin, and he wrote a book called The Affirmative Action Empire, Nations and Nationalism in the Soviet Union, 1923 to 1939, or something like that.
Wow.
And part of the reason why he wrote that book was because he was trying to answer the question, kind of like me, he kind of shared an ethnic background of being a German from Russia, is how did we end up here in America, and what exactly happened, and why didn't we know about any of this? But in his book, it's an amazing book. It's basically about what's been going on in the United States for the last decade. It's about DEI. It's about anti-racism. It's about all these words we have.
All the critical theories.
All of it.
Yeah.
Every last detail of it is in this book with the Russian word for it, and everything is spelled out in this text. And having read that kind of armed me to know what was confronting us in schools. When they came out with DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, diversity, unity of socialist content through diversity of form.
Yep.
Equity, there is no direct translation of the word equity. And even when our public schools tried to translate for the Russian students, they translated it to equality or fairness. They didn't put the Soviet word for equity, which is actual equality.
And I forget, it was started with the K, right? James was pronouncing it.
Yeah, that's the
yes.
the Russian. I don't speak Russian, so I may have an American accent with it. But yeah, Fakticheske ravенство is the Russian word for actual equality. And then inclusion, that word was definitely used. If you look at those three words, diversity, actual equality, and inclusion, in Google Ngram, I think it's called, where you can track the frequency of word use throughout in publications throughout time. If you look at around the revolution, you see those words spike. I've posted the graphs of them, and then they, about a decade or 20 years after the revolution, they start to come down.
What I find crazy is when they claim that the true word, what the true word is for equity in Russian is actual, actual equality. It's the way that they describe it here, right? Leftists in this country will say, well, we need to reach for equity because equity is what true equality is, right? They kind of phrase it that way. And it's funny that people that, whether they know it or not, because I feel like so many of these educators, they don't actually know it. They're parroting what they learned in school, where the
Right.
professors are typically the ones that have done this extra research, that know what they are teaching. They understand, they've read your Herbert Marcuse, they've read your Jacques Derrida, they've read your big Soviet scholars and your critical theorists and things like that. So they understand what they're teaching, but you're putting it into these college educated fools, and they're just going out and regurgitating it. So it's something where I feel like, we should go at the teachers, but not necessarily to the point where every single one of them understand what they're teaching. That's where I'm landing on with teachers, that if they know what they're teaching, then they're pretty evil. But if they don't know and they're ignorant to it, we just need to educate them on why to stop.
Yeah. And there's not a one of them that'll point their finger to Stalin for any
No,
of this.
never his fault.
So yeah, so we're diversity, equity, inclusion, and this actual equality had to be achieved through inequality of the oppressor. The Great Russian ethnic group was the one who was supposed to sacrifice and be
Yep.
discriminated against, just like they insert white or whatever today. But that the accusation of Great Russian chauvinism, equivalent to white supremacy culture or
White privilege,
whatever,
whatever we want to call it.
that could be that could be hurled at
Yeah.
minorities too, just like they throw whiteness at minorities who aren't following the Communist Party line
Yep.
today. It was an exact
Because
same
you're not
setup.
politically the right thing, right? It's less about being like, just because you weren't a pure Russian, if you were showing a chauvinistic attitude towards being a Russian nationalist, you were expressing Russian chauvinism, which is being white, right? You're showing whiteness. If you're,
Right.
acting like a white American, you're showing your privilege, essentially, is what it's called now.
Yeah, and there's documentation about college students, even if a minority would just hurl out, if they're getting bad grades, just say, "Oh, it's Great Russian chauvinism," and then we'll pass you on to the next. Just like you'd see at a university today. It's saying that these things are repeating themselves. But the whole point was for the Great Russians to defeat Great Russian chauvinism amongst themselves. They had to be segregated, just like when they affinity group people today. The white people are put aside and say, your job is to, only you can fight whiteness amongst yourselves. And then they segregate the other minorities out. And this happened in the Soviet Union too. Everybody was segregated. Everybody was segregated into not just large republics, but within large republics, other minorities would be segregated into small county-like size groupings, or even down to the size of a collective farm, so much that whole minority was just grouped
That's
together,
crazy.
so that everyone they saw was like them. And the reason they did that was because they wanted people to believe communism was their own innate desire, their own ethnic group's creation and goal in life.
Which is what
And
we're seeing
when
now with all the different, like, oh, be queer. Like, that is your queer group, or your trans group, or your black, or your Spanish. And did they do these whole entire like fake groupings like we do now with the Asian Pacific Islanders, like assuming that Pacific Islanders and Asians have anything in common at all?
there was a period where they kept trying to break everybody down into the smallest possible dialect speaking group they could. 190 different language group, dialects in the Soviet Union. So they really tried to keep breaking them down into the smallest possible grouping, so that they all believed that they were, communism was their own creation. But then they sort of broke them up, and sometimes there were larger groupings, like pan-Turkic speaking groups that were lumped together.
At least they tried to keep groups that spoke similar languages together. Right now, we're just like, you guys all kind of look the same, so we'll group you together because you kind of look similar. Like, in the most racist way possible, we do it.
That is true, but in Washington, in the states that are more further along, like in Washington, we have the public schools have to label kids by their uh, biological nationality, basically. We have over 80 categories for Black students that we group students
Wow.
by. And this is by law and is forced. If the parents don't declare this very specific ethnicity of their child, the school will do it for you.
It's like you think about what we've gone through as a country and how we've been, and it's hard to, you were more raised, like your formative years were in the late 80s, early 90s, right? Like I was born in 88, so I was late 90s, early 2000s. So it's like even just going through all of the times that we went through, we were beyond so much of this shit in so many ways. And it wasn't until Barack Obama was elected and he started to really push things leftward. And people will talk about Donald Trump becoming this great divider. I remember being in college, 2008, him winning, and then later that year talking about how, oh, that kid could have been my son and the police acted stupidly. And right there, boom. I just remember that is kind of a moment to me where it was like, that was the tipping point of everything starting to get to where we are now. Is once Obama started to insert himself and his race into everything that was going on socially. And basically, it was a very anti cop message. And it seemed to be getting to where we are today. Do you see any similarities to the messaging from any of these Democrats that were in power, like your Barack Obamas and things like that, to what was going on during the Soviet time?
It was actually a White House committee of um, an Asian Pacific Islander group that these racial categorization policies in states like Washington came
Jesus.
from, because they started noticing they wanted to nitpick about the achievement gap between, let's say, South Asians, East Indians versus Vietnamese, for example. They wanted to start to nitpick, and so if you look in Washington now, there's roughly 40 categories of Asian students and Pacific Islanders, and some maybe even more than that they want to divide everybody up and nitpick the differences in achievement, even though everyone's doing horrible. Nitpick those little differences and fight over who's got it worse, who's more
Well, yeah, because
oppressed.
it's a race to the
And
bottom, right? A lot of their theory is a race to the
it
bottom. It's who could be the biggest
race
victim.
to, and that's what happened in the Soviet Union when they came up with BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people, whatever it is. I was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe you brought that back from 100 years ago and ripped it off. Nobody ever questioned when they started using BIPOC. And the light snapped in my
Is
head.
it a
It's like,
Soviet
you
phrase?
took backwards and indigenous peoples of communism and reappropriated it to the United States. I can't believe you ripped that thing off. Anyhow, so you had backwards, which they just inserted black for
Yeah,
backwards, and indigenous peoples. These were the two rhetorics of abuse in the Soviet Union, and not all backwards people were indigenous, but not all indigenous people were backwards. So there was kind of a hierarchy of
yep.
oppression, which led to a race to the bottom because everyone wanted to be backwards because they thought they could get more funding for their cultural promotion, and education and other things, and quotas in government or whatever. But yeah, backwards and indigenous peoples was the thing. Backwards being more oppressed than just simply indigenous
That's
peoples.
crazy.
Um, even the German Republic there, the Volga Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, got into the race to the bottom, and they tried to claim that they qualified as backwards, even though they had a pretty high literacy rate to start with. Um, yeah, everyone got in on the race to the bottom, and they tried to come up with a coefficient of backwardness to try to officiate who actually was backwards and who wasn't. But when they came up with BIPOC, I couldn't believe they recycled that one. It was so obvious they ripped it
So
off.
when did the Soviets start to use DEI and as a tool of control and things like that? When was the time that they started to use it, and when did it start to come over into America?
Okay, so in 1921, even before that, they started theorizing this, kind of putting it down on paper and in speeches around 1914, even before the
Wow.
revolution. Few years after the revolution in 1921, Stalin kind of gave this speech at the 10th Party Congress where he basically gave a racial liberation speech that only communism can liberate people from racial oppression. And this is when these backwards and oppressed minorities, we need to give them their rights through this inequality of the oppressor scheme. 1921 is when the policies kind of started, but 1923, the 12th Party Congress, and when it really, the hammer really hit, and these policies, these called nationalities policies, really became implemented, and then from there got spread to the schools and other
And all of
things.
this
But it pervaded all
And
aspects
all
of
this is
life,
fresh off the First
all
World
aspects
War,
of
right?
life.
This is all fresh coming off the First World War in the 20s, because the First World War ended in 18 officially and didn't kind of the skirmishes didn't stop until 21, 22, which Russia was heavily involved in
Yeah.
that war.
Right. So after citizens kind of ran out of their bullets that they had left over from fighting that war is when kind of things kind of came to an
Gotcha.
end. And then Christmas Eve, or the day before Christmas, or New Year's Eve, day before New Year's Eve, 1922 is when the Soviet Union came into existence officially as the USSR. So it was just a couple months after that, in the spring, that these DEI policies hit.
That's insane to think it's 100 years ago. It's quite literally 100 years ago that this started.
On the dime 100 years
That's
ago.
wild that
Yeah,
this all started 100, because
it's
we would think of DEI, CRT, the critical theories as they came here as being fairly new, fairly modern. But I guess in terms of history, it's still in the modern context, because the 20s is still part of the modern time, especially with the industrialization and stuff like that. But it doesn't feel, these things don't feel like 100 years ago. We learn about the First and Second World War, and it doesn't feel like they're that long ago, when they really are now at this point, right? It's a long time ago that the First World War occurred, and then the creation of the USSR from being like Russia, Prussia, all that stuff. They're breaking off there, those points. So they start to introduce it. It starts to become policy in the Soviet Union. What's the result of the policy in the Soviet Union?
Well, it comes through education and everything. So everyone's forced to speak their indigenous language. Everyone has to use their native language now, and is segregated in groups that speak their native language, unless you're
So they
Russian, of
Tower of
course. Then
Babel
you're
their own people, basically. They're just there is no common
yeah,
language. You
yeah.
Tower of Babel, you all can't communicate.
And that's part of the reason why this history is kind of hard to unearth, is because it's scattered in so many different languages from that time period. And not only is it scattered in different languages, but Stalin declared that everyone basically had to use the Latin
Ooh.
alphabet instead of Cyrillic, because the great Russian oppressor, used the Cyrillic alphabet, and the Latin alphabet was more progressive, inherently more progressive. Um, and everyone had to use the Latin script. Their alphabets were changed as they were being dictated a new socialist version of their history and culture. That did something by erasing all the previous writing about their history and culture that had been existed, by
Were
switching the
there any
alphabet.
tearing down of statues during this time? Like we've seen in our
Um,
country lately?
I don't know to what I know. There was,
Definitely some
there was
stuff.
the
Yeah.
ripping down of the
Yeah. Yeah.
church
Yeah.
bells and the removing of the steeples and all that stuff. So I don't know how much about
Statues.
statues, because some of these were rural
Yeah.
areas where there wasn't a lot of stuff like
Hmm.
that anyway. But the villages I'm familiar with anyway. Um, where were we?
Kind of what was the result? What came about from
Oh, the
DEI being
result.
a
Yeah.
policy in the Soviet
So,
Union?
people were kind of, here's the trick. People get ethno vanity kind of. They're probably a little bit relieved to be able to speak their own language, especially if the czars had forced the Russian
Yep.
language on them relatively recently. Um, they fell for it, I think, and people might even say that it was wrong, but there was a trick all along, and that trick was the formula: national inform, socialistic content. You were basically turned into a costume. Here's your ethnic costume. You can speak your own language, but the filling is all going to be socialism. You can put on your native dress, your ethnic costume, but you're going to be a socialist in thought and your goals and aims, and you're part of the collective ideology and the party line now, and that's it. And that's what we see going on
100%.
now. I know in Washington State, they tried to create a Black history curriculum, which is basically, we're going to dictate a socialist version of your history to you, and that's it. They segregate Native kids in schools now to have their own classes where they're being dictated a socialist version of their history and culture.
It's so
Um,
radical. Like my radical idea is I want to get rid of the history months because I think they're terrible. I feel like,
yeah.
this is me like being a historian in my thinking. We shortchange women and we shortchange black people 100% by only giving them a month each, right? Like you could, with you being a historian and knowing what you know, essentially you're a historian now because everyone that does research is that. And it's like you could give these individuals, these important black members of history in Americas and stuff like that, these important women, they can get so much more if you actually put them in the proper curriculum instead of crunching them in. And we learn about the same like six people from grades K through 12 in all of these things. And um, I feel like it's purposeful, right? Because they don't want us to know truly about anything about these people. And essentially, especially with black people, just how integrated black people were into American culture up until they started to basically get resegregated, right? Like once slavery was done, a lot of these slaves who had skills because they worked would take these skills and open up, become carpenters, become smiths, become whatever their skills were, and then they were pretty prominent in their towns. It would work for white people and black people. They became politicians, and we don't learn about any of that. And I think it's similar to what you want. I think these history months are very much, as I'm looking at, in that vein of we only want to teach you just we want you to know about that collective group. Nothing more, nothing less.
Yeah. So what ended up happening was, in some places where the Russians were getting, discriminated against in employment and other things, it started to cause some friction. And in some places, it came down to, okay, we're going to fight about it. We're literally going to come to punches about this if you're going to say we can't be employed in this factory or whatever. There was, you know, Russian children in like Belarus or other places, they had to speak the other language, and some of them were very ashamed. If two little kids were like speaking to each other in Russian, they would get caught by the teacher or whatever, and they would feel really ashamed to be speaking their language. It finally came to, I think I read in Terry Martin's book, The Affirmative Action Empire, that it came down to I think it was a teacher talking to his own wife in Russian, and getting in trouble for it, and it blew up in a magazine
Wow.
article of what had happened. But so yeah, there was this whole thing was going on. There was some friction because of the discrimination against the majority group, but that wasn't the only thing. There was also the idea, the idea that the groups weren't going along with national informed socialist and content, that they might want to have some national content of their own, that they might want to be independent or pursue their own goals as
Oh
a
boy.
republic and not fall in line with the party line. And that is where that wasn't allowed. And so I'm glad in James's podcast, he actually mentioned the backlash
He
against
did.
Ukraine and linking Holodomor to these DEI
Now,
policies.
explain what the Holodomor was for people that don't know what it is. What went on during the Holodomor?
Man, if you want to be changed as a person, read firsthand accounts of what happened there. Apparently, there's a guy named Ronald Vossler who I think he's at a regional Midwest college. I don't know if he's still a professor or not, but he wrote a book where he took letters from people starving to death during
Oh,
Holodomor in Ukraine that they had written to America, to relatives in America. And these letters were published in newspapers in North Dakota, South Dakota, some of the Canadian provinces. And basically, people are explaining how they're starving to death. Please send us money so we can survive. The Soviet Union was actually putting ads in Midwest newspapers saying, you can send money to Russia because we need your foreign currency because our currency isn't worth anything. Our rubles aren't worth anything anymore. So send your foreign currency and you can buy your starving relatives at these Torgson stores, some flour or whatever they might be able to need at these high prices. And they might live that way. And that was a crazy thing that happened during Holodomor, is there was actually advertisements for these Torgson stores which are foreign currency exchange stores, in Midwest newspapers alongside letters of people starving to
that
death.
is awful.
And so he translated these into English and published a book of them. And if you read, sometimes you can only read a paragraph a day because they're so intense of when you're reading about emaciated people starving to death, and their children are emaciated and starving, it's
Yeah.
intense. It's hard to read. Anyhow,
Yeah, I'm
so what
actually on
happened?
his page right now looking. I think what is one of them? We'll meet again in heaven is I
Yeah,
think
that's
like
the name of the book. You
ooh.
order that book and read it, it will change you as a person.
And
You
then The
will.
Old God Still Lives is a companion book to that apparently. Like that
That's
is
the earlier. That's more of the revolution, the
gotcha.
1917 revolution time
Wow.
period. But We'll Meet Again in Heaven covers the Holodomor. The
Just that
central chapter of
title.
that is called
Oh,
"Crucifixion by Hunger," and it's intense.
yeah. Jesus, that's insane. I mean,
It also covers mass dekulakization, and when people are getting the high taxes, which we're starting to see now, the high taxes starting to be thrown on, and people being removed from their homes and deported to northern labor camps.
so I'm gonna have you give another explanation for
Yeah,
those that don't know. What's a kulak? I'm getting your teacher hat on
yeah,
here, brother.
yeah. So a kulak, I think it means fist in Russian when you translate it, but
Mhm.
it wasn't just the wealthy class, because by 1928-29, when mass dekulakization was really kicking in, yeah, it was people who were doing a little better, might have had been able to pay somebody to help with the harvest or whatever, but it was basically used for anyone who had believed in individualism and wasn't going along with the collective ideology, wasn't going to join the collective. And they used to have people gather together in a room and basically ask who wants to join the collective, and people would either raise their hands or not. And the people who didn't got sent to labor camps.
Wow.
That's how it went down. um yeah, that's a kulak. It ended up being a very significant part of the population. I know the villages my family's from, um, it was basically a racial categorization. It applied to everyone of the ethnic group.
And you find that it kind of grows, right? Once they start to run out of kulaks, they invent more, right? It always expands because there's always people that are against what we're doing, and you need to be a better communist, you need to be a better socialist, you need to be better, and the definitions always start to expand, and we're seeing that also in this country, right? Like there's always a new group, and you're not enough. You're not basically lashing yourself enough in the current day and age.
Right. The whole point of DEI was to develop communist cadres of each ethnicity so that the next phase comes when it turns into class warfare, they could carry that out amongst their own group. So it wouldn't appear racist if you're doing it amongst your own group, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So
So we keep on alluding to how it's kind of gone into America. To your knowledge, when did it start to permeate and really start to come into the country, start to get into America? And I know you don't read many of the scholarly things currently, but you are seeing it happen. What is it? We talked about DEI, but what does it look like today as well? So when did it come in, and what is it looking like?
I started my teaching career in the mid to late 90s, and there were traces of it even back then, because in my first position, I took over for a teacher who had had a stroke. And
Oof.
that teacher just happened to be an older Black lesbian. Um, Check all the boxes you want. I don't, I didn't know her. For all I know, she was a pretty good teacher. And I'm not going to associate any identity politics to her at all. But in hiring me to replace her, it was viewed as not a good move by the district.
Wait, you're
And
not an older Black lesbian?
no, and
for
you're not
for
an
the
older
for the
Black lesbian,
listeners
so
that
I
aren't
couldn't compete.
watching.
And so that concept was kind of around by then, because I did my best that I could as a new teacher. You're still learning the ropes a little bit,
Yeah.
but I was I was put down for my demographics. And the superintendent of the district at a meeting actually said, we didn't do a very good job of hiring this guy. And
We used to call it political correctness in the 90s, right? It's essentially what it was back then.
yeah. And so I ended up leaving that district after that superintendent said that to me. And the weird thing is that I started working in a private school where the district where not only the district administrators but their science teachers were sending their children to the not a very good hire that we just got rid of, which is kind of ironic, but
Very.
that's the way it happens. So there were traces of it back then in the mid to late 90s already. Um, Diversity started to become a thing in I would say around 2000, where it actually started getting into like criteria for accreditation.
Yep.
At that level, it was during the Obama era, especially towards his second term, is when it really started kicking in, and you started seeing it. Okay, to be accredited as a school, private school now, you need to meet these diversity criteria. And then around the time the Evergreen meltdown happened, by then it started kicking into overdrive. And 2017, when that whole Evergreen meltdown happened, that's the 100th anniversary of the 1917 October Revolution.
No
So
way.
I kind of consider that, I kind of benchmark that, what
Yeah.
happened at Evergreen. I know just because it was across town from me, but I kind of benchmark that as the equivalent of the October Revolution, because that's when we really started seeing those things happen all over and intensify.
See, I feel like your story is the perfect caution for everyone that is pushing for school choice. And James has talked about this before, but you were essentially what everyone's pushing for, right? You were the private school administrator, and everyone wants the choice to be able to choose to go to the private school. And there's things like that going on there. It's like there are still standards set, and maybe now it's going to start to be peeled back with Trump. And it is seemingly to be a lot to be peeled back right now. He's doing things, but it's not like the private schools are infallible. You can work hard to try and make sure that your private school is better than your public school and things like that. But you're a perfect example of you should have been in a place that was considered safe for everything that we know with school choice. And here you are fighting these same battles that we're fighting in public schools. And you essentially lost that battle, right? In a private school. So what would you say to the school choice movement in terms of, any caution to what they're wishing for right now in terms of, all the things that they're pushing for?
From what I've seen in Washington State, the market is completely captured. I would say within upper 90% completely captured.
Sucks.
There isn't, they don't have school choice to the extent in Washington State as other states, but they do have a growing charter school movement. And you want to see some messed up ideology in charter schools. They can do DEI more effectively and more efficiently and better than anybody else.
Because they fully design their own curriculum. They don't have to respond to the state at all, right? In terms of charter, if they don't want to take state money, then they don't have to respond to state curriculum standards for the most part, right?
No, they still I mean, there's still the state still issues teacher certification requirements that apply to private school teachers. For example, every private school teacher in Washington has to either have a state certification, meaning they've been indoctrinated with DEI standards as part of that training. It's required, or they have to be under the direct supervision of someone who has.
Okay.
So there isn't a single private school teacher who hasn't been indoctrinated or is under the direct supervision of someone who has.
Gotcha.
Those are the laws. And it extends down to, even homeschooling. If you haven't gone through enough years of university, they don't think you're smart enough to be a homeschool parent. So you have to be under the supervision of a teacher who has been indoctrinated. It's captured. If you want to see something, look at the Rainier Valley Leadership Academy. It's a charter school in the south end of Seattle. They have something associated with it called the Harriet Tubman. It's like a medical clinic for freedom and health. It's basically the Underground Railroad of gender affirming care and abortion services.
Wow.
In public schools. The clinic, it has a ton of administrators and only a couple actual clinicians that are providing the services. Tons of fundraising, tons of money coming into it, but they're there to, provide acupuncture, massages, gender affirming care, hormones, and contraception and abortion services, as far as I can tell.
That's insane.
And it's all done in the name of freedom, just like Stalin said, this is racial liberation. It's in the name of freedom, but everything's put into effect through compulsion. And that's school choice. It's a trap as far as I'm concerned. If it wasn't a captured market, we could talk about, competition and how things evolve that way. But with the way it's captured, I don't see that happening.
It's one of those things where people in high places in education are probably like, oh no, please don't. Sure. One of those things oh, please don't send them to that private school, which has the same exact teachers that we have been educating forever. So I just want to get to Nate G. It's a good compliment. He says, great guest, Alex. So you are, Nate likes you. And if Nate likes you, that's our measuring stick. If Nate likes you, that's a good thing around here. He's basically the boss at this point. He's here with us every single time. So I want to get into with you again specifically what made you start to be brave enough to speak out? Because, um, you've been doing it seemingly for a little while. You know what you're talking about. When did you start speaking out? Like what yearish, and why did you start speaking out?
Once the laws started hitting full force, coming through the legislature, the ethnic studies laws, the changes to certification requiring DEI and those kind of things, the racial categorization laws. So that was around, like I said, around the beginning of the revolution, around 2017, on the 100-year delay switch time scale is when I really started becoming. That's when I started showing up to the state K-12 agency meetings, and I was the only witness to what was going on in a lot of these meetings. Like when ethnic studies laws were passed, I would show up to these meetings and I would be the only witness to what was going on in these meetings who wasn't in on it. Like the only one who wasn't, part of the committee or a state employee. I was the only general citizen there that was listening and watching and taking screenshots, etc.
So how do you get it through to the common person that's just sitting here watching it today that how important it is to just even go to your school board meeting? We have twice a month here where I am, at least like every other Tuesday they hold it. And like, how do you, as a former educator, as someone that is, engulfed in this stuff and what's going on, how do you try and get through to people? Like, just try to make once a month. Maybe you don't have to do both, but just try to make it to some, and just, even if you don't have to say anything, listen, take notes, and start to understand what's going on. How do you convince people to do that? Because these are the mundane things that are important, right? Going to your council meetings, going to, the committee meetings that they hold in public, which are massive, your board of ed meetings, your state K through 12 meetings, right? How do you you as a person who's um trying to raise the alarm, how do you try and get through to people to do this type of stuff, because it's boring stuff sometimes?
Yeah. What I did was I just found the most relevant committees at the state K-12 agencies or the state board as a whole, and found their schedule of when they were meeting, subscribed to their email list so I got reminders of when the meetings were. And the thing is, after COVID, they pretty much broadcast over everything as a so you can watch it online, and sometimes they save it, sometimes they don't, so you can go back and play it if you missed it and you were
Yeah.
at work or whatever. But take the time to find the schedule, track down the schedule, and put it on your calendar. If you're someone like me that works outside, sorry guys, we're going to turn off whatever radio station we're listening to, and we're going to listen to a school board meeting while we're hammering nails this hour. That's what I used to do.
Have you found some of the guys, as you're doing that with them, start listening and going like, wait, what the fuck are they talking about? What are they saying? And like kind of getting a little interested
Yeah,
with you?
you get weird looks because some of these meetings they're very cult like. I mean,
Yeah.
they start out with the land acknowledgments, and then they stand with the moment of silence for cultural oppression or what, but it's all ritualistic. It's very liturgical, and
It's
they start to
bizarre.
realize that this is a bizarre cult really fast once you start listening to these meetings.
That's educating your children and deciding your children's education. It's not like these are just a bunch of people meeting on their own to
Right.
praise some sort of like foreign cult craziness. They're deciding what your children are learning.
Yep. And making bizarre choices about that.
Yeah.
It's very cult like, and yeah, but once you start sitting through these meetings and hearing what they're saying, it'll become intuitive what you need to do. I mean, you asked, what made me speak up and not have any fear. I know what I know in the history, knowing the family roots of what happened to everybody who didn't make it to America.
Yeah.
You know, if my relatives wouldn't have made it to America, I wouldn't be here talking to you right now. Every They would have been killed
Crazy.
either through starvation or labor camps or whatever. So yeah, once you know that and see the same exact policies, implemented in America, just all they did was translate from Russian to English. They didn't try to hide anything. They just said it in English.
Yeah.
Doing this thing where we pretend it's like some academic creation, that's a distraction, and it cost us a lot of years of just knowing the truth that they just translated this stuff directly from Russian.
It's wild to think, and it's like, but like we have now been so, I think, desensitized to the threat of Russia and what former Soviet Union Marxism, communism poses, because essentially we were quite literally taught that, it was bad, and we're taught that McCarthy was a kook, where now when you look at it, McCarthy was right about everything. Maybe not pointing the finger and getting some people, he might have over exaggerated some of the people he brought to Congress. But when he was talking about like there's communists everywhere in our government, in Hollywood, in music, in everything, in all the institutions, McCarthy was way ahead of his time. He knew exactly what he was talking about. He just didn't have anybody on his side to point him in the right direction.
Yeah, he knew it. He had the fear. Yeah. And once you know that if you don't fight, whatever consequences happen to you, you lose your job, you're put in a different career you might not have been started out in, you lose your children. Whatever is going to happen to you is not as bad as what's going to happen if you don't stand up and fight for it with all you have. That's why all my free time is dedicated to this cause, because I know what happens, and we're so far down the road already. It's pretty scary.
Have you had any backlash or consequences to speaking up outside of, obviously with the administrator stuff, but since you really started to truly speak out and put out all the information that you do on X, has there been any sort of backlash in your life that you want to talk about? And has there been any good that has come out of what you're doing?
Yeah, I can talk about both. Obviously the state, sort of the contractors that work for state education, and some of the
They don't
they're
like
not
very
too
much.
happy. Sometimes they go after me very directly, and
They know who
it's
you
pretty
are.
awful stuff, but it's kind of comical at the same time.
Yeah.
So I'm used to the put downs and that kind of stuff. It doesn't really bother me that much. Other than basically being blacklisted from the profession, that I really, really enjoyed and loved and was good at. I don't think there's been too many bad consequences, except for our family courts in America, which I'd like to spend just a couple minutes talking
Go
about
for
how
it.
it affected me personally. They have been weaponized to pursue people who speak out against communism, use that as pretend you're a dangerous parent and take away all your parental rights. It's happened to me. The
Sorry to
claim
hear
by the
that.
attorneys were that because I spoke, this is the quote, extensively about communism in schools, and I discussed my son's World War II homework with him. So that I spoke about World War II atrocities. I was especially condemned on that point, in addition to speaking extensively about communism in schools. My parental rights were permanently removed until my children are 18.
Sorry to hear that.
I have two sons. Yeah, they're teenagers. I will not be able to go watch a soccer game of theirs. I won't be able to attend their graduation. Won't even be able to help them out with their homework. I have a son who's struggling with his math homework. I have to write checks to a tutor now, instead of being an award-winning math teacher myself, actually sit down and help him, because I speak extensively about communism in schools, and I talked about World War II homework.
But you know what, though? Like you said, they're coming after you because you're knowledgeable. And if your knowledge truly spreads, you will be effective. And that's their fear. The fear is that, this show is not a very big show, but the fear is that if this show with guests like you can get out there, you're going to be effective, because throughout this whole conversation, you didn't go into like heavy, deep scholarly stuff, which you probably can, right? You probably do know the scholarly background, but you did your best to kind of keep this in layman's, and we can go on for probably hours getting into the nitty gritty about the government side of what Stalin did and how he implemented it governmentally and how it affected intricate in all the regions and things like that. But that's not as effective as being to put it out in layman terms, which is things that you're very good at, which is why you are a threat. So it's shitty what happened to you. Just, it sucks that these types of things happen, but it's the government warfare, right? It's lawfare that is being used against people that can expose something that they've obviously been trying to hide for decades now, because we don't learn about it in schools. We don't learn about the biggest, outside of the Holocaust. We don't learn about the biggest atrocities in the history of man. We don't learn about the gulags and, basically that there were re-education camps that millions died at. We don't learn about the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward in China, which high estimate 100 million people died, low estimate 20 million. We don't learn about all these things, and there's a reason why, right? Like, you as an educator, you as someone, like, there's obviously a reason why we are having this stuff hidden from us.
Yeah, I mean, Stalin himself hid it from the world. When he wrote the short course on party history, he took all that nationalities policy DEI stuff and basically deleted it. There was part of one paragraph in the whole book on something that was consumed everybody's lives for years. So it was pretty much erased. And like I said, it was scattered in all the different languages and different alphabets that then changed multiple times. So it basically got erased from history, more or less. And it's important to take those voices that did exist and documented it then, especially with how they were. There's a lot of, quotes I can give from my minorities that had this force on them that say, hey, this was all a trick. There is no actual equality. There's equality of misery and starvation and suffering and that. But
you're going to be equal somehow, not the way you like it.
Equality, but there's no human rights at all.
Yeah, you are equally oppressed. That is it.
Yep. And that's what eventually came of everything. It became what they call the we-they dichotomy. Instead of all these little minority groups that were fighting for their identity and all that kind of stuff, it just became we, the oppressed people, versus they, the party.
And that's how it always ends up, right? It always ends up, one of the things that they love to use is class warfare, the haves versus the have-nots. And when they're all said and done, there is never a bigger spread of haves and have-nots. Like, we don't realize in this country and a lot of the Western world what a blessing a middle class is, because I never grew up without a middle class in America. You didn't really grow up, but at your time. But there are people that at some point America didn't have one. And we're one of the first countries in modern society to pride ourselves on having a middle class. And it's our biggest buffer against those types of governments and those types of ideologies taking over. But if we allow this to keep on filtering in, we see our youth that is so very nihilistic and narcissistic. And that is such a start. And we're starting to see it. We're starting to see a slow shift back, but we have an uphill battle. And you're somebody, Steven, that I think we need the voice. We need your voice in this fight. I just want to get these few comments from Nate G right here. You should have gotten Father of the Year for speaking against communism. And he also says, from one father to another, my deepest condolences about. So, Steven, I want to thank you for coming on, because I thought this was such a great conversation. Obviously, we could have gotten more in depth into a lot of things. It's hard to cram into a little over an hour, but appreciate what you do. And I'm really happy I decided to reach out to you and brought you on, because this is everything I thought it was going to be in terms of just a good introduction for people to be curious about more, to sit there and maybe think about it and go, man, that Steven guy, he sounds like he might be full of shit. So let me go read up on it. And then when they read up on it, that's kind of how a lot of people start, right? They think you're wrong. Then they go start to research, and they find so much more than they ever thought they would see.
Yeah, if I could, might give another resource for people to look at, maybe, because
Go
this,
for it.
like I said, this information is kind of rare. After World War II, there were a lot of people who had fled the Soviet Union in the West, and Roosevelt and Stalin and
Yeah, we
Churchill all
really
met
didn't get into
together.
Roosevelt. Yeah.
Yeah, they came up with a secret plan that they were going to arrest every last person who fled the Soviet Union or were abducted by the Nazis, and arrest them and send them to gulags or be executed. And millions of people, a lot of people don't know this. It's called Operation Keelhaul is the name for it. The forced repatriations is another name for what it's called. But there were millions that were arrested or executed and sent to labor camps in the Central Asia or Siberia. But there were a few people that escaped that fate, and those few people, there was a few people that were interviewed, a couple hundred actually, by Harvard in around 1950. It's called the Harvard Project on the Soviet Social System. Online, you can Google it and find it. It's a searchable database of interviews of these Soviet refugees, and you might have to know a little bit of Russian, but most of it's in English, and it's searchable. You can
Well,
type
with
in
Google Translate now, you can always just pop in, translate,
right,
boom, you're
right.
good.
So yeah, anyhow, it's searchable. And they interview people about social issues like education or whatever. So you can read about what things were like during Lenin and Stalin's era, and make connections. There's even a part about the disgusting books they were putting in the schools.
Oh,
Uh, and how repulsive they were, and how they were pushing sexuality on children, and
the
only a few would
leftists
go along
always go
with
for
it.
this.
Yeah, it's just it's it. So yeah, that's a good resource, because like I said, there's not very many resources available in English for people to read about this time period.
And I highly recommend anybody that's curious go to Scholar Google. It's opposite of Google. It is a source where it is all peer-reviewed scholarly papers, and you could just type in whatever subject you want and got Scholar Google, and it's all peer-reviewed, submitted journals, like sources, like articles there. So you could just go and have some research going on there, and you'll get things that were, you know, scholarly, sourced and things like that. And you'll also get to see how many times it was cited as well. So you'll find out if this was a paper that's widely frequently used. If you see a couple hundred, 1,000 citations, this is being used in schools. So I recommend going on Scholar Google if you're ever curious and want to learn more about a subject and you kind of don't know where to start, really don't know books, like what to go start off with some articles there. You can't go wrong. Just quite literally type in whatever subject you want, boom, a bunch of articles will pop up. So hopefully some more of the stuff about the Soviet DEI will pop up. You might have to figure out how to word it better. There might be some like actual Google searches, or you want to figure out how to word things and go research. Here is a nice little shameless plug for Steven right here. Go to Steven's X page, StevenWelliever.com. Am I saying your last name right? How the hell do you say your last name? I keep on feel like I'm saying it wrong.
Welliver.
Welliver. Welliever, you kind of accepted them all.
Yeah.
So I want to throw this up there. This is your X page. So I want people to go there. And as you can see, I'm already following here. We follow each other, but this is the X page. And here's one you just posted 5 hours ago. The NAEP scores show the effects of progressive pedagogy and communist revolution. So you are just posting consistently about all the stuff going on here. You're reposting people in the know. So I highly, highly, highly recommend going follow Steven if you want to learn more about everything that's going on, because he's a fantastic follow. So once again, Steven, I appreciate you coming on, man. I really do.
All right.
So once again, you can go find them there. You can find us at the Alex Cuesta Show everywhere, wherever you're watching from. As always, we appreciate it. YouTube, Rumble, Kick, Facebook, X. You're all awesome. If you're listening via podcast, go give us a 5-star rating and leave a review. For our boy Nate G, always hanging out over here. Oh, he has a few more comments. Let's jump in here real quick. Boom, boom, boom. He said, had some kids crying. Did he say Harvard boys? Oh, and Harvard boys were the guys sent over to sabotage the post-Soviet Russia as well, if I heard from him right. Is that what it was, Stephen?
They were saying about the social system there.
Okay. And he says Tom Woods covers the Harvard boys extensively. All right. So we're going to close out here. Nate, as always, we appreciate all the comments. We love you over here. Steven, we'll definitely want to have you back on at some point as you dive in a little more. I think we just kind of scratched the surface. Maybe we can have a little bit more of a focused conversation next time. We'll pick something, we'll dive into it. But you're also somebody that I really hope that if you're watching this and you have somebody that you follow, definitely say, hey, this is a guy you need to have on because you need to get out there. You need to show what you know more. And you're somebody that I'm happy to have, fighting side by side in this battle. And you're a resource that I'm going to start using because I want to get into the battle more in terms of school stuff. And it's tough to know where to start. So you're somebody that I'm going to definitely start to lean on. So you're going to get annoyed by me soon, and that's okay. Bye, everyone.